Hello, Steve.
Good morning, Lilou.
How are you doing in Manchester?
I'm pretty good, thanks. How are you?
Pretty good. Really, really good. Actually, I love having those conversations. I think we all need those little reminders, and I know people all around the world want those and are looking for those and enjoy very much your work because you've been part of that big list of the 100 most influential spiritual leaders. So I want to congratulate you on that.
Well, thanks very much. Yeah.
And I look forward to reading your latest book, Out of the Darkness. Is that right?
Well, actually, I had a new book which was published last June. It's Back to Sanity. So Out of the Darkness was the book before Back to Sanity.
Okay.
So Out of the Darkness was published last year, and Back to Sanity was published this year.
Excellent. So we're going to speak about all that because I was really drawn to that title for now, Out of Darkness, but we can go into the latest one too. You, from my understanding, you're lecturing at the Leeds University on psychology, and you're interested about psychology and spirituality. I would very much love to know what is your view and what is for you spiritual awakening.
Mm-hmm. Well, spiritual awakening is a transformation in the way you perceive the world. It's a transformation in your relationship to the world, and it's an expansion and an intensification of consciousness so that you perceive a wider, a more intense reality. And it's a transcendence of the separateness, the sense of separateness, which human beings often experience. It's a transcendence of separateness into connection, into a greater sense of connection with other people, a greater sense of connection with nature, and a greater sense of connection with the whole cosmos.
Mm-hmm. And for you to experience spiritual awakening, it is we have to go through suffering, unfortunately. It's part of the process.
Not necessarily. I mean, in my research, I did a lot of research on the triggers or factors which bring people into spiritual awakening. As a psychologist, I did this research. And it was partly a result of my own experiences too, my own experiences in my own experience of spiritual transformation and spiritual awakening. But I did find that the major factor in spiritual transformation did tend to be intense turmoil, intense psychological suffering. That's not to say that it's the only factor, but it was the most intense, the most prevalent factor. So I interviewed several dozen people, about 70 or 80 people who'd undergone spiritual transformation. And the vast majority of them, probably about 70% of them, all underwent a period of very intense turmoil. So it's people who'd been suffering from severe depression, people who suffered from bereavement. Bereavement was a very big factor, people whose loved ones had died. And also very negative life events like divorce or losing your job, that kind of thing. But those are the big factors. So it'd be maybe several years of turmoil or a very short, intense burst of turmoil. And what was happening there was that the turmoil would somehow break down the normal sense of self. The normal sense of ego, with all its roles and all its attachments, would fall away. And suddenly there'd be this a space inside the person's being. You know, they would become literally empty because the normal self would fall away. Mm-hmm. And it was almost as if a latent higher self would emerge and fill this empty space. Mm-hmm. So, but that's not to say that it's the only factor. I mean, I also encountered people who'd undergone spiritual awakening in a purely accidental way, where there's no apparent factors. And also people who'd been through many years of intense spiritual practice, intense meditation, or following a spiritual tradition like Buddhism. So there's a variety of ways, but turmoil and trauma does seem to be the main factor.
Mm-hmm. And it was the case for Eckhart Tolle. You've interviewed him, you've connected with him. He went through depression, severe depression.
Yeah, that's right. I interviewed Eckhart Tolle for my book. And yeah, he was in some ways one of the clearest cases of that. You know, he was, as he writes in The Power of Now, until the age of 29, he lived in a state of constant depression and anxiety, until he reached the point where he couldn't take it anymore, and he fell asleep one night intending to commit suicide. But yeah, his ego seemed to suddenly collapse. The old ego suddenly dissolved away, and he woke in this new world. You know, there was a new self looking at a new world.
Yeah.
So yeah, he's a very good example of that.
Yeah, the septic, the people that don't believe or don't see this connection or this bigger realm or what you call the spiritual awakening, often I hear often that they say, oh, it's because that person was needed something else to hang on to,
Mm.
rather than a real state of being. What do you? I mean, how do you interact with in these type of conversations?
People do sometimes say that it's a self-delusion, or they
Yeah.
say, particularly with people who've been suffering from turmoil and trauma, they say that the trauma was so great that they had to create this delusory reality to escape it. But I think there are some very good reasons why that's not the case. Partly it's because, if you're escaping from reality, you're escaping into narcissism, into self-delusion. You're going away from reality. But all of these people are actually going deeper into reality. In every way, their relationship to reality expands. They perceive a more intense reality. They have more authentic relationships with other people. They live more altruistically. They help other people. And in some cases, we often have this idea that spiritual awakening means withdrawing from the world. It means going to live in caves or going to a monastery, or to live in the forests of India,
Yeah.
and so forth. But a lot of the people who actually go through spiritual awakening become more engaged with the world. They feel a strong sense of mission, a strong altruistic drive to relieve other people's suffering and to improve other people's predicaments. So in every way, these people became more involved in the world. They became more engaged with reality, if you like. So it's very difficult to say that it would be a self-delusion. In every way, they become better functioning human beings. They've gone into a sort of higher state. So if they were escaping, they would surely go the other way. So that's a good reason why it's an authentic and real state.
Yeah. What is, did you find out? Because I'm so interested about those stories. Obviously, I travel the world and interview people that have done that shift. And I'm always interested in that kind of tipping point beyond the suffering and all the outside. What makes a person all of a sudden be connected to everything and have a whole new perspective? What did you see as the mechanism or something or the switch, or have you found out?
Yeah, I'll give you a couple of examples. I'll tell you a couple of the
Yeah.
stories from the people in the book. There was a lady I interviewed who lives here in England called Glyn, and her daughter died. Her daughter died at the age of 20 when she had a small baby in a very unexplained way. It was all very sudden and very mysterious, but she died. And as a consequence, she was obviously devastated by this, but as a consequence, everything else in her life fell away too. She lost her job, she had financial problems, and everything collapsed. In the space of 1 or 2 years, literally everything collapsed. And she was devastated and depressed for a long time. But suddenly, without warning, one day, about 2 years after her daughter's death, she was driving a car, and suddenly she felt something was happening inside her. She was undergoing a kind of shift. And suddenly, she describes it as if the gates were suddenly opening, almost as if floodgates were opening, and suddenly knowledge was flooding through. So she had to pull in at the car park. She had to stop driving. She had to pull in at the lay-by. And she knew that something incredibly important was happening. So she just decided to, sit back and let it happen. So suddenly she was flooded with this amazing knowledge. She felt as though she had visions about the future. She could sense what other people were thinking. She had lots of revelations about the meaning of life. And it took a while for it to settle down. It was kind of overwhelming. But it took a while to settle down. And once it had settled down, after a few days, she felt that she was a new person. She felt this amazing sense of appreciation for living in the world. She felt this amazing sense of connection to the whole of reality. And she felt suddenly removed from any anxiety or depression. She felt she suddenly transcended them. So although she still loved her daughter, she felt in some way that she no longer grieved for her. She sort of transcended the grief. And that remained constant. It's been a few years now, but she's still in that same state. She's in the same state of amazing connection and appreciation. And another case was a counsellor I used to work with at my college called Kevin, and he had been quite a severe alcoholic, and like many alcoholics, within a few years, slowly his life began to crumble away. His wife left him. He lost his business because people no longer trusted him. And slowly he lost all his savings. He'd been quite a successful businessman. He'd been an architect with his own company, but slowly he lost everything. So in the end, he just had £200 left in his bank account. He was living in a tiny, scruffy flat here in Manchester. And he decided to drink the rest of his money away, and he thought about committing suicide because he had nothing left. But he decided he couldn't commit suicide because he'd been brought up as a spiritualist to believe in life after death. So he knew that suicide wasn't the solution. Mm-hmm. So he decided to go along to some AA meetings. And after 1 or 2 weeks, he decided to, well, in AA they called it the process of letting go or handing over your problem. Mm-hmm. He decided to go through this process where he decided, this problem is too big for me to deal with, so I'm going to hand it over to some higher power. So he did that mentally. He handed over his problem. And suddenly, a bit like Glyn, he was flooded with this sense of well-being, as if something had suddenly given way. And he suddenly felt amazingly grateful and amazingly serene inside. And as if the whole of the world had suddenly lit up with meaning. And he describes it, he said he felt like he was on honeymoon. Everything was just incredibly alive. And again, that remained with him for, it's been 15 years now, and he's still in that same state of appreciation and wonder at the miracle of being alive. So I think the important thing here is that all of these people, they go through so much loss and so much turmoil that all of the attachments that we have, all of the ego attachments which we have, fall away. Like, for example, our attachment to the future falls away, our attachment to hopes and ambitions falls away. Our attachment to wealth falls away because our wealth is taken away. Our roles are taken away in society. Our relationships are broken down. So literally everything breaks down. But because the ego is made up of all these attachments, mm-hmm. these attachments are the building blocks of the ego. So when the building blocks are taken away, the whole ego just collapses, like a bit like an earthquake where a building collapses in an earthquake. So suddenly these people are completely empty, which gives them a terrible sense of loss, a terrible sense of desolation. Mm-hmm. But because they're so empty inside, there's this space for a latent higher self to emerge. And that seems to be what happens, that this latent higher self emerges into the space and becomes their normal sense of identity.
Could it also be linked to something happening with the heart?
In what way?
In like an opening of the heart, the heart being shut down before, and that would open up to something else, like the ego collapses, but the heart also feels like it opens up to something bigger, to receive and to connect.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of describing it. Yeah, you could very well describe it in that way. It's almost as if many people, and particularly these people we're talking about, their identity is so focused on the ego that it kind of closes off everything else in their being. Yeah. So when the ego collapses, suddenly there's space for other aspects to come through, and you could describe it. The heart suddenly opens. Identity suddenly goes down from the ego down to the heart. Mm.
How do you feel? A lot of people talk of 2012. How do you feel about that? Do you feel a shift in England or wherever you travel, or have you ever been interested by all those prophecies pointing out 2012? Do you see something happening?
I do see something happening, not just in England but all around the world. But I'm a bit skeptical about relating it in particular to 2012. I think in general there's a gradual shift in consciousness. I think more and more people are having spiritual experiences, temporary spiritual experiences, but also more and more people are undergoing permanent spiritual awakening too. And that was one of the things I found when I was writing Out of the Darkness. I found it so easy to to collect examples of this and to interview people, because they were everywhere around me. People. One of my students at university had had this experience. One of my colleagues, a couple of people in my wider circle of acquaintances. So I became aware that so many people are undergoing this shift. But one of the interesting things was that a lot of them didn't actually understand it, because they'd had no background in spirituality. They didn't know anything about meditation or healing or spiritual traditions like Buddhism. They knew nothing about it. So when this happened, when they underwent this shift, they were sometimes a little bit confused. They knew they felt a sense of well-being. They knew something fantastic had happened to them. But they were at the same time a little bit confused. And people around them, maybe they tried to explain it, and people were saying, "Oh, you sound like you've gone a bit crazy."
Especially at the beginning when you tried to explain.
Yeah, they were saying maybe you should see a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
But slowly they gravitated towards other spiritual people. They gravitated towards spiritual books and spiritual groups. So eventually, they did begin to understand it. So yeah, I mean, I'm kind of doubtful that 2012 in itself is a very significant milestone in human history. But I think, in general, over the last few decades and in the future, in the immediate future, something special and significant is happening to human consciousness.
How is your latest? Can you tell us a little bit more about your latest book and why you decided to add that piece in your work? And because it is not a small task to work on a book and put it out and then promote it and go out in the world. So you've invested your time as an author, as a researcher, as a psychologue into this new topic or area. Could you tell us more? Why?
Yeah, you mean my latest book, Back to Sanity? Yeah. This is a book called Back to Sanity, Healing the Madness of the Human Mind. And it really began when I was younger, when I was a teenager or in my early 20s. I often had a feeling that there's something not quite right about human beings. And when I looked around me and the way people were living, even in my own family, it's partly because in those days, when I was a teenager, it was before computers, before the internet. So everybody around me used to watch TV all the time. The TV was always on in my house. And I'd walk down the street and I'd look into people's living rooms and everybody would be watching TV in the evening. And I'd think, what's going on? Why do people spend their whole evenings, why do people waste their whole evenings staring at this picture box in the corner of their rooms? And, so it seemed to me that it was based on a human need to escape from your own self. If human beings were happy if they were happy with themselves, we would be able to just sit in a room without turning the TV on, without turning the computer on. We would just be happy just to be. So it seemed to me that human beings are not really happy just to be. And I always thought there was a restlessness inside people too. Most people in general live in a state of dissatisfaction. They're striving to gain something. They're striving to achieve more in the future. They're either striving to acquire more wealth and possessions or to acquire more status and more power or fame. And then when I was younger, I looked back at human history. I started to read about history and archaeology. And if you look back at history, it's just an endless catalogue of warfare and conflict for the last few thousand years. Endless brutality and cruelty. So, that also suggests that there's something wrong with human beings. So in Back to Sanity, I propose the idea that most human beings suffer from a psychological disorder, which I call humania, as in human madness. So this psychological disorder creates the sense of restlessness, which makes us determined to strive for things in the future. It makes it very difficult for us to live in the moment and to live inside ourselves. And it's also responsible for all of the conflict in human history, all of the warfare, all of the oppression, and even the environmental destruction which we're living through at the moment. They're all linked in some way to humania. But I've always been interested in indigenous people too. And if you compare, for example, when the Europeans went to America and Australia in the 17th century, 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, they wrote reports about how the native peoples lived. And it seems to me that they didn't suffer from this restlessness and this discontent. They did have a sense of connection to nature. They respected the natural world, and they lived in harmony with the natural world. And in some ways, we seem to have lost that. So in Back to Sanity, I try to explain why we've lost that sense of connection, why we suffer from this psychological disorder. But most importantly, I suggest what we can do to overcome this disorder and how we can learn to live in harmony with ourselves and with the world.
Mm-hmm. And also, I know that more and more people are, some people blame the conspiracy theory and that there's people that want to lead the world. And when you look at history or nowadays, the big media, you see negative stories, but there's really some wonderful things happening too around the world. But it's just that it wasn't talked about at the time, and still not enough. Then people like me, ordinary people, have to come out and do the work. Do you believe in some of those, that it is also maybe a group of individuals, or that we just trapped ourselves, or what? How do you see? Do you see that it could also be related to some external factors that little by little we've been living this way and we just had to for survival?
Well, interestingly, if you look back really far in human history, if you go back 6,000 years ago and before then everybody, the traditional idea is that early human beings were living in caves. They were hitting each other over the head with sticks. They were sort of grunting at each other. They couldn't speak properly, and also that they lived really terrible, really hard and nasty lives. There's a famous quote from an English philosopher called Thomas Hobbes that life has always been nasty, brutish and short. But in actual fact, if you look into the research into archaeology, you find that early human beings actually lived very harmonious lives and very, in some ways, easy lives too, because they were all hunter-gatherers, mostly hunter-gatherers, which means that they would camp in a particular site for 3 or 4 months or 6 months and then move on to the next one. They would usually live in the forest, and food was everywhere. They didn't have to work very hard to get food. Food was everywhere around them. So anthropologists believe that early human beings probably spent 3 or 4 hours a day gathering food, and the rest of the time was leisure time. They had endless time to talk and to sing and to engage in spiritual practices. And it seems to be that they felt a very strong connection to nature. They were aware of spirit all around them. Almost all indigenous peoples in the world have a term for spirit force. They have a word which means soul force or spirit force, the soul which lives inside the world. So they seem to have been constantly aware of this force. So they had a sense of sacredness, a sense that all of nature was sacred and they were part of this sacred web of nature. And it's really only later that when human beings started farming and when cities developed, that's when things started to go downhill. Mm-hmm. That's when life became really hard. That's when lifespans decreased. But also that's when tiny groups of people began to dominate the rest of the society. Mm-hmm. In hunter-gatherer groups, they are very egalitarian. Everybody shares decisions. There's no leaders, or if there are leaders, they're very quite nominal figures. They're very democratic and very egalitarian. But suddenly, when people start farming and towns and cities develop, suddenly a small number of privileged people begin to take control, and they begin to oppress 90 or 95% of the rest of the population. They have all the power, they control wealth and resources, and they live lives of luxury while the rest of the population lives a life of squalor and deprivation. And that's always been the case throughout recorded history. The last few thousand years, it's always been a case of the aristocrats or the nobles dominating and oppressing 90% of the population. But in some ways, I'm quite optimistic because that's begun to change over the last 100 or 200 years, especially in Europe. things have become more equal again. You know, the old feudal system has broken down, and there was a lot more equality around. So in some ways, I'm quite optimistic.
That's good. Do you think there is a different kind of leadership that is needed in the world, or some changes that could happen, or some prise de conscience, as we say in French, you know, that you start to realize that you've been waiting for something, but we are the one that we've been waiting for, kind of thing?
Hmm. I think one of the problems in our societies is that the people who become leaders are usually the people who should not be leaders, the people who should be prevented from being leaders. Because it's usually the people who have the strongest drive for power, the strongest desire to control other people. You know, there's people with the strongest ambition. And usually those people don't have very much empathy and responsibility to other people. They tend to be quite narcissistic and quite self-centered. And yeah, but it's a sad fact that these people usually rise to positions of prominence, not just politicians, but all over our society, you know, managers in corporations, even, you know, head teachers at schools, people in local government. It's always the people with the least empathy and responsibility and conscience which take these positions of power. So I think we should follow similar practices to Native Americans or hunter-gatherer peoples.
Mm-hmm.
They don't let people decide to become leaders. They choose leaders. They vote. You know, they decide that such and such a person should become leader, even if they don't want to. So the collective group decides who is the wisest person in the group and elects them as leaders. And often people don't want to be leaders. They say, "Oh, I'm quite happy. I'm quite happy being on the sidelines, living a life of leisure." They say, "No, you're wise. You've got to be the leader." So leaders do not choose themselves. They are chosen by other people. Mm. So I think that would be much better.
Mm-hmm. And do you, a lot of people are talking of a new economy, a new paradigm. Do you have advice or insights on that?
Over the last 300 years, I think there's been a major change in human beings occurring. You know, if you look back at human history, which I did in my book before, I look back at the last few thousand years of history and all of the nightmarish oppression and conflict. But also, if you go back 300 years, it's as if suddenly there was a flowering of human consciousness. Suddenly people began to empathize with one another. They began to relate to animals and to nature. And that's why in the 18th century, suddenly there was a movement against slavery. Suddenly women's rights became important and animal rights. Suddenly people began to reconnect with nature, which led to the Romantic movement in poetry and art and music. So suddenly there was a transcendence of separateness. And I think that's continuing now. It's intensifying. I think people collectively are transcending ego separateness. They're beginning to connect with others. They're connecting more and more to nature. They're connecting more and more to the spiritual essence of the cosmos. So to me, it is an evolutionary movement. I think it's an evolutionary shift. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look back at evolution, you can see it as a progressive and slow intensification of consciousness in different life forms. And that's continuing inside human beings. Our own consciousness collectively is intensifying and expanding. I think that's happening very, very quickly at the moment. Mm-hmm.
Because some people talk about a turning point, the same way that human beings experience spiritual awakening. Maybe our whole planet can experience that after a certain number of people possibly are awakened? Or how do you see this turning point on a more global, big scale? Since you've studied it on a personal level also.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you look back at evolution, higher forms of life seem to be latent in lower forms of life. Everything seems to be latent. So that even in, say, insects or lower forms of life, such as insects, the latent higher stages, the higher stages of life were somehow dormant and waiting to emerge. And I think it's interesting when I talk to all of the people in Out of the Darkness, it was as if there was a latent higher self waiting to emerge inside them. And I think this higher self is possibly latent inside everybody. I think it's the next evolutionary step for the human race. The next evolutionary step for us is a more expansive awareness where we can sense, where we transcend separateness and sense the spiritual essence common to all living beings, and where we transcend anxiety and feelings of insecurity and fear. And, you know, I really do think that this is latent inside human beings, and that slowly we're progressing collectively towards this state. When that does happen, it will be, you know, we will live in a transformed world. The world will be a much more harmonious and a much more peaceful place.
Because some people are already living in that state, right? There's some people that are enlightened and living that, more or less. I guess there's different degrees of it. But a lot of us, and I know a lot of people watching these videos, feel connected, and they're about to, or most of the time they are already, they feel in this spiritual awakening. So it's beautiful, but there's, as you're saying, there's possibly a different stage where all of us then would really live in this world. Not just, some other author talks of a new earth, but the old earth and the new earth kind of collaborate, not collaborating, but two different currents and way of living, in fear or in love. So some people see it's already there. Some people see it's two different planets or two different worlds simultaneously living together, but no longer kind of being able to speak the same language, unfortunately.
Well, you know, I think we're still in minority. People who have experienced some form of spiritual awakening, even if it's only temporary, even if it comes and goes, we're still a minority, you know, still out there in the world. You know, the world is still dominated by materialism and selfishness and greed. But I think slowly, spiritual awakening is spreading to the whole community, to the whole of the human race. And in some ways, you know, I don't think it's going to transform the world in a radical way. I think the shift will be quite gentle.
Okay.
And, you know, I think when you experience spiritual awakening, in some ways it can be quite ordinary almost. You know, the world is still the world. We still live in the same world, but it's a slightly different world. It's a world of connection. It's a world of beauty. And we feel a sense of appreciation and serenity inside ourselves. But we still live in the same world. We still interact with other people. The difference is that we no longer feel competition and rivalry and fear towards other people. We feel warmth and empathy towards other people. And we no longer strive for to achieve our own desires. We no longer strive to accumulate possessions and status. The main striving of our life becomes to alleviate other people's suffering, to help other people, to share with other people. So there's the substitution of individualistic pursuits or individualistic desires with a desire for collective well-being.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for this juicy conversation, as I like to call them, because they bring us the juice of life, you know, the essence, and we can taste it, feel it, and somewhat live it more and more each day, or get reminders. So thank you for this conversation. I hope we can meet in Manchester, since I'll be going there and on my way to Glasgow to the I Can Do It conference. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Lilou.
It was fun.
Me too. I enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.